February 1955. Berlin, American sector. In the basement of an unremarkable warehouse on Rudower Chaussee, 200 meters from the Soviet zone border, U.S. Army engineer Major William Harvey stood at the entrance to a shaft. Depth, 6 meters below ground. Direction, due east, straight toward the heart of the Soviet occupation zone. The target lay 450 meters away, the main communications cable linking the headquarters of the group of Soviet forces in Germany with Moscow. 4 construction crews worked around the clock. Every 8 hours, a shift change. Soil was removed at night, disguised as construction debris. Tunnel walls were reinforced with steel rings of British manufacture. Ventilation operated silently. Soviet posts stood 100 meters overhead. Operation Gold's budget had already exceeded $6 million. For comparison, the annual budget of the entire KGB residency in West Berlin was $300,000. Harvey knew what the Politburo did not. In 8 months, American technicians would begin intercepting every telephone conversation, every secret dispatch, every order traveling through that cable. More than 40,000 hours of recordings, names of agents, troop dispositions, offensive plans in case of war, internal disagreements within Soviet command. What he did not know, a traitor had already reported to Moscow. But the KGB remained silent. Because exposing the tunnel meant exposing the source. And the source was worth more. This was a chess match where even defeat became victory. And the price of each move was measured not in pawns, but in technology, money, and the systemic superiority of one intelligence service over another. The Berlin Tunnel was not merely an act of espionage. It was a demonstration of a fundamental asymmetry in the Cold War. The West's ability to marshal vast economic resources, cutting-edge engineering, and technological sophistication for intelligence gathering on a scale the Soviet system could neither match nor counter. While the KGB excelled at recruiting human sources through ideology and coercion, the CIA and MI6 were pioneering industrial-scale technical intelligence, a factory of information extraction that turned espionage into a production line. The tunnel represented what Soviet intelligence could never replicate: the seamless integration of massive capital investment, advanced construction techniques, state-of-the-art recording equipment, and hundreds of linguists working in shifts to process an ocean of intercepted communications. When Harvey reported to CIA Director Allen Dulles that the operation would cost more than any previous peacetime intelligence project, Dulles authorized it without hesitation. The United States could afford to spend $6 million on a single tunnel. The Soviet Union could barely afford to pay its agents. This disparity reflected a deeper truth. The Cold War would be decided not by the cunning of individual spies, but by the capacity of entire systems to sustain technological competition. And in 1955, as Harvey's crews burrowed beneath the streets of Berlin, that capacity gap was already unbridgeable. The idea originated in 1951, not in Washington, but in Vienna. British Secret Intelligence Service officer Peter Lunn had successfully tapped Soviet communications cables in the Austrian capital using a similar tunnel technique. When MI6 shared the operation's results with the CIA, the Americans immediately recognized the potential for replication on a grander scale. Berlin, divided and crawling with Soviet military infrastructure, presented the perfect target. The technical challenges were formidable. The tunnel would need to extend nearly 500 meters through waterlogged Berlin soil, clay mixed with groundwater and unstable sand. It would need to remain undetected for months, possibly years. It would need to house not just a passive tap, but an entire underground listening post with recording equipment, amplifiers, and climate control to prevent condensation from destroying sensitive electronics. American engineers studied geological surveys of the border zone. They identified the cable's location through months of reconnaissance, a trunk line carrying landline communications from Soviet military headquarters in Karlshorst to Moscow via Poland. The cable lay approximately 70 centimeters underground in the Soviet sector, running parallel to the Schonefelder Chaussee. The Americans would need to tunnel from their sector, pass beneath the border, and surface directly beneath the cable without alerting Soviet guards patrolling above. The construction plan was audacious. The tunnel would begin in the basement of a specially constructed warehouse in Rudo, part of the American sector. The warehouse itself would serve as cover, officially processing radar equipment, but actually concealing the tunnel entrance and providing space for excavated soil. The shaft would descend 6 meters to avoid Soviet listening devices, then proceed horizontally beneath the border. At the Soviet end, a vertical chamber would house the tap itself. Harvey assembled a team of U.S. Army engineers sworn to secrecy. British partners provided technical expertise on cable tapping from their Vienna operation. The construction began in September 1954. What Soviet border guards saw, if they noticed anything, was routine warehouse activity in the American sector. What they did not see was 3,000 tons of soil being removed grain by grain from beneath their feet. The tunnel's construction required innovations that would later become standard in covert engineering. The excavation method used electric-powered digging equipment modified to operate with minimal vibration. Traditional pneumatic drills would have sent seismic signals detectable by Soviet monitoring equipment. Instead, American engineers employed cutting heads that rotated slowly through the soil, pulverizing rather than shattering the earth. Every cubic meter of excavated material presented a disposal problem. 3,000 tons of clay and sand could not simply be trucked away without attracting attention. Harvey's solution was methodical. The soil was mixed with concrete and used to create the warehouse's foundation and floor, then covered with legitimate construction materials. To casual observers and to Soviet surveillance, the warehouse was being reinforced for heavy equipment storage. In reality, it was consuming the tunnel's waste. The tunnel walls required stabilization. Berlin's water table sits high, and without proper shoring, the passage would collapse within days. British engineers designed a system of interlocking steel segments, each ring precisely machined to fit the tunnel's diameter. These segments were lowered through the shaft and assembled underground, creating a rigid tube that held back both soil and groundwater. The segments were manufactured in Britain, shipped to Germany as construction materials, and installed section by section as the tunnel advanced. Ventilation presented another challenge. 450 meters of enclosed space, 6 meters underground, with no natural airflow. Without ventilation, workers would suffocate within hours. With ventilation, the noise of fans might alert Soviet patrols. American engineers developed a system of baffled air ducts that drew fresh air from the warehouse basement and exhausted stale air through the same route. Using fans designed for submarine use, silent, efficient, and capable of operating continuously. The tunnel advanced at approximately 4 meters per day. Every 8 hours, a new crew descended to continue the work. The pace was dictated not by digging speed, but by the need for absolute silence. Workers wore soft-soled shoes. Tools were wrapped in cloth. Conversations were conducted in whispers. Above ground, Soviet soldiers walked their patrols, oblivious to the fact that American engineers were literally undermining their territory. By February 1955, the tunnel had reached the Soviet sector. The final phase, ascending to the cable itself, required extraordinary precision. Too shallow, and the tap chamber would break the surface. Too deep, and workers would miss the cable entirely. American engineers used seismic measurements taken months earlier to calculate the exact depth. They surfaced within centimeters of the target. The tap chamber at the tunnel's eastern terminus housed equipment that represented the cutting edge of 1950s signal intelligence. The Soviet cable carried not one, but multiple communication channels. Telephone lines for military headquarters, teletype circuits for encrypted messages, and command channels for air defense networks. Tapping this cable required technology the Soviets assumed did not exist. CIA technicians installed inductive taps, devices that intercepted electromagnetic signals without physically cutting the cable. This non-invasive method meant the Soviets would detect no drop in signal strength, no interruption in service. The signals were amplified, recorded on magnetic tape, and stored in a climate-controlled vault within the tap chamber itself. Every 24 hours, technicians retrieved the tapes and transported them to a processing facility in the American sector. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. The tunnel intercepted an average of 400 telephone conversations per day. Teletype traffic added hundreds more pages of text. Soviet officers, believing their landlines were secure, spoke with remarkable candor. They discussed troop movements, complained about supply shortages, debated strategic doctrine. They gossiped about their superiors, criticized policies, revealed personal anxieties about the reliability of their East German allies. The CIA established a processing center in Berlin, staffed by over 300 linguists, translators, and analysts. Most were émigrés from Eastern Europe, native speakers of Russian and German. They worked in shifts, transcribing recordings, translating conversations, and indexing intelligence by subject matter. The volume was staggering. By the time the operation concluded, the tunnel had produced 43,000 hours of recorded conversations and roughly 40,000 teletype messages. The transcripts filled more than 50,000 pages. What the Americans learned reshaped their understanding of Soviet military capabilities and intentions. They discovered that Soviet forces in Germany were poorly supplied, that morale was low, that officers frequently disregarded orders from Moscow. They identified weak points in Soviet air defenses, learned the names and personalities of key commanders, and gained insight into contingency plans for a potential conflict in Europe. The intelligence was not merely tactical, it was strategic, revealing the internal contradictions and fragilities of the Soviet system. What CIA officers did not know in February 1955 was that the KGB had been aware of Operation Gold since its inception. George Blake, a British intelligence officer working as a liaison between MI6 and the CIA, was a Soviet agent. In 1953, during the planning phase, Blake informed his KGB handlers of the tunnel project. He provided blueprints, construction schedules, and target locations. The Soviets knew everything, but they did nothing. This decision remains one of the most enigmatic episodes of Cold War intelligence. The KGB could have arrested Blake quietly, fed disinformation through the tunnel, or simply severed the cable and claimed a maintenance issue. Instead, they allowed the operation to continue for 11 months, from May 1955 until April 1956, when Soviet engineers accidentally discovered the tunnel during routine maintenance work. Soviet calculations were ruthless. Blake was too valuable to expose. He was embedded deep within British intelligence, with access to NATO planning, MI6 operations, and CIA activities across Europe. Burning him to stop one tunnel would sacrifice years of high-level intelligence. The KGB leadership made a cold assessment. Let the Americans have their tactical intelligence from Berlin. Keep Blake in place for strategic intelligence from London. This created a bizarre situation. American analysts were processing genuine Soviet communications, unaware that the KGB knew they were listening. Soviet officers were speaking on tapped lines, unaware that their superiors had allowed the compromise to protect a more valuable source. The intelligence flowing through the tunnel was real. 40,000 hours of authentic conversations, unfiltered and uncensored. But the larger game was being played at a different level entirely. When the Soviets finally discovered the tunnel in April 1956, they staged the revelation for maximum propaganda value. They invited Western journalists to tour the facility, denouncing it as an act of American aggression and espionage. Soviet military engineers expressed theatrical outrage. The East German press published photographs of the tunnel, complete with captions condemning Western imperialism. The Americans, for their part, said nothing. The CIA neither confirmed nor denied the tunnel's existence. But within the intelligence community, the operation was considered a triumph. Yes, the Soviets had shut it down. Yes, they had scored a propaganda victory. But the United States had extracted 11 months of unparalleled intelligence on Soviet military operations in Germany. And the recordings were already in Washington, being analyzed by hundreds of specialists. The Berlin Tunnel exposed a fundamental asymmetry in Cold War intelligence. The KGB was superb at recruiting human sources, ideological agents like Blake, mercenary informants, and blackmailed officials. But technical intelligence on the scale of Operation Gold was beyond Soviet capabilities in the 1950s. The reasons were systemic. First, financial. The tunnel cost $6 million at a time when the CIA's annual budget for covert operations in Europe exceeded $100 million. The Soviet Union, still rebuilding from World War II, could not allocate comparable resources to a single intelligence project. The KGB's entire foreign intelligence budget was a fraction of the CIA's European spending. Second, technological. The recording equipment, inductive taps, and signal amplifiers used in the tunnel were products of American electronics firms. Companies that thrived in a competitive marketplace, driven by military contracts and consumer demand. The Soviet electronics industry, centralized and starved of investment, lagged years behind. Soviet tape recorders were bulky, unreliable, and required constant maintenance. American equipment ran for months without failure. Third, logistical. The tunnel required seamless coordination between multiple agencies. The CIA for intelligence collection, the U.S. Army for engineering support, MI6 for technical expertise, and the State Department for diplomatic cover. The operation involved hundreds of personnel, each with specialized skills, working toward a single objective. The Soviet system, despite its vaunted centralization, struggled with interagency coordination. The KGB and GRU frequently competed rather than collaborated. Redundancy and inefficiency were endemic. The Soviets did attempt technical intelligence operations in Berlin. They ran wiretaps on Western phone lines, planted listening devices in embassies, and monitored radio communications. But these were small-scale efforts, pinprick operations compared to the industrial scale of the American tunnel. The KGB could recruit a secretary to steal documents. The CIA could build a subterranean intelligence factory. This pattern would repeat throughout the Cold War. When the United States wanted intelligence, it threw money and technology at the problem. When the Soviet Union wanted intelligence, it relied on human ingenuity and ideological fervor. Both approaches had their successes, but in a prolonged competition, the system that could mass-produce intelligence on an industrial scale held a decisive advantage. The Berlin Tunnel's operational life ended in April 1956, but its legacy shaped intelligence doctrine for decades. The CIA learned that technical intelligence could supplement, and in some cases replace, human sources. Satellites, electronic surveillance, and signals intelligence would become the backbone of American intelligence gathering. The tunnel was a proof of concept. Given enough money and engineering expertise, the United States could penetrate even the most secure Soviet communications networks. The recordings from the tunnel continued to provide intelligence long after the operation ended. Analysts spent years combing through transcripts, identifying patterns in Soviet military communications, mapping command hierarchies, and assessing the reliability of information gleaned from human sources. The tunnel's intelligence proved invaluable during the 1956 Hungarian uprising, when CIA analysts used insights from the recordings to predict Soviet military responses. For the Soviets, the tunnel was both an embarrassment and a lesson. KGB leadership recognized that their communication security was inadequate against an adversary willing to invest millions in technical operations. They upgraded cable security, instituted new encryption protocols, and expanded counterintelligence efforts in East Germany. But these were reactive measures, responses to American innovation rather than proactive developments. The tunnel also illustrated a deeper truth about the Cold War. Both sides engaged in espionage, both violated international norms, both pursued intelligence with ruthless efficiency. But the nature of their systems produced different methods. The Soviet Union relied on human sources because it could not afford large-scale technical operations. The United States invested in technology because it had the resources and the industrial base to do so. This asymmetry extended beyond intelligence. In military procurement, the Soviets built vast quantities of simpler equipment. The Americans built smaller quantities of more sophisticated systems. In the space race, the Soviets achieved early victories through brute force engineering. The Americans eventually surpassed them through miniaturization and computer technology. In economic competition, the Soviets focused on heavy industry. The Americans developed consumer electronics, semiconductors, and information technology. The tunnel was a microcosm of these broader trends. It demonstrated that when the West chose to apply its economic and technological advantages systematically, the Soviet system struggled to respond in kind. And over the course of 40 years, that struggle would prove insurmountable. In the decades following the Cold War's end, former KGB officers and Soviet military officials reflected on operations like the Berlin Tunnel with a mixture of admiration and resignation. Oleg Kalugin, a KGB general who served in the 1950s and 1960s, later acknowledged that Soviet intelligence was fighting an uphill battle against Western technical capabilities. He noted that the KGB's greatest successes came from human sources, but that such sources were vulnerable, expensive to maintain, and limited in the scope of intelligence they could provide. Markus Wolf, head of East German foreign intelligence, wrote in his memoirs that the Berlin Tunnel had been a wake-up call for the Eastern Bloc. He described the operation as evidence of the West's willingness to invest extraordinary resources in intelligence gathering, resources the socialist world could not match. Wolf noted that even after the tunnel's discovery, Soviet communication security remained inadequate because the necessary technology, encryption systems, secure cables, electronic countermeasures, required an electronics industry the USSR did not possess. Yuri Kobaladze, a KGB spokesman in the 1990s, admitted that the tunnel had been allowed to operate as long as it did because protecting George Blake was deemed more valuable than stopping one intelligence operation. He characterized the decision as strategically sound, but tactically humiliating. The KGB had knowingly permitted the Americans to eavesdrop on Soviet military communications. because they lacked the means to exploit Blake's position while simultaneously shutting down the tunnel without exposing him. These acknowledgments, delivered years after the Soviet Union's collapse, confirmed what Western intelligence analysts had long suspected. The Cold War was not a contest between equals. It was a prolonged competition between two systems with fundamentally different capacities. One system could mobilize vast resources for sustained technological projects. The other could inspire individual acts of ideological commitment, but struggled to translate that commitment into systemic advantage. The Berlin Tunnel was neither the first nor the last technical intelligence operation of the Cold War. It was, however, emblematic of a pattern that defined the conflict. When the United States identified an intelligence target, it mobilized capital, technology, and expertise on a scale the Soviet Union could not replicate. The tunnel cost $6 million and employed hundreds of engineers, technicians, linguists, and analysts. It produced 43,000 hours of recordings and 50,000 pages of transcripts. It operated for 11 months and provided intelligence that shaped American policy in Europe for years. The Soviets knew about the tunnel from the beginning. They allowed it to continue. They eventually shut it down. But they could not build one of their own. That inability, that gap between espionage through human cunning and espionage through industrial capacity, defined the deeper struggle of the Cold War. The Soviet system excelled at sacrifice, at mobilizing its population for grand projects, at achieving stunning feats through sheer determination. But it could not sustain the kind of broad-based technological competition that the West waged effortlessly. It could not produce consumer electronics that doubled in capability every 2 years. It could not build an economy where innovation emerged from thousands of companies competing in open markets. It could not match the wealth that allowed the CIA to spend $6 million on a single tunnel without flinching. The Berlin Tunnel was a tactical intelligence operation, but it was also a demonstration of something larger. The capacity of the Western system to apply resources systematically, relentlessly, and at scale. That capacity, more than any single battle or crisis, determined the outcome of the Cold War. The conflict was won not in the dramatic confrontations that history remembers. The Berlin airlift, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the fall of the wall. But in 10,000 smaller contests where one side could afford to build tunnels and the other could not. In the end, the Cold War was an economic marathon disguised as a military standoff.